You have to make the work for yourself. And the ideas have to be natural ideas that you follow to the conclusion. Because being an artist, it comes with a lot of suffering. So why not take some pleasure? And that pleasure is intellectual pleasure, as you develop as an individual. And that's the strength in life as an artist, is it is an intellectual journey. It's not a technical journey. Too much is made perhaps of technical prowess, but actually it's the thoughts, the ideas behind it. They're the key things. They're the things that make your life a pleasure when possibly your working life is a pain. Time allows you to develop the idea. The time invested in helps you flesh out the various tones in the work. Some of my larger projects have taken 2 years, and across that 2 years of physical labour, my skill set has changed and the ideas have matured. I think if it was just the idea that I had at the start, it wouldn't have developed that maturity. It wouldn't have the depth that's developed through time.
I suppose I first got to see a number of works by Robert when I became familiar with his hammers. Now, you know, it's a very simple, utilitarian, functional object, hammer or a mallet, sort of thing we've seen around in every household, and every carpenter used to have one and still uses a hammer. But they've changed in character. They've sprouted wings and looked as though they might be airborne, or they're wrapped up, and you know, you don't know why they're wrapped up. Are they wrapped up to protect them, to stop them from rusting? Is it just a purely utilitarian, functional sort of attitude? Or is this some precious, precious object which is wrapped up to protect it? And again, there's that lovely sense of contradiction which intrigues me very much.
My earliest memories, really, of drawing were finding this particular spot on the floor where the carpet met the lino, and I could lie on the carpet and draw on the lino, and I must have spent hours and hours on that particular spot. It's a kind of fond memory. It's always been a very large part of my life. I guess it was a difficult decision to make it in school to continue with art. There was a lot of pressure to join the more normal workforce. But I think really now in my 40s, looking back, I don't think I really could have done anything else. It just suits me so perfectly. I went to an all-boys high school where the only thing that mattered was rugby. And in fact, the art class ended up just being me. In my final year, I was the only student doing art. It was very difficult. I think there was no mentors around me. There were no examples of professional artists to follow. Small town New Zealand in the 1980s, it was impossible really to see a way to make art a career. But having said that, the alternatives just looked so terrible to me. My father was a hobbyist sculptor, so the tools were around me growing up. It was a very familiar thing to do, to work with your hands. And sculpture is a fairly open field, I believe, and one that has a very broad set of skills. It suited my personality very well. I don't draw at all for my sculpture. So for 20 years, I did no drawing whatsoever, just mark making for the purposes of cutting. And although I drew ferociously as a teenager, I never found a way to express myself with it, so I stopped. And as time went on, I guess it became a block. And one of the ways I broke out of that was to build a drawing space, really corner myself in a position where there's no excuses anymore but to draw. And immediately it felt like coming home. So it's had quite a profound impact on my work, because drawing is such conceptually immediate. The ideas just literally flow out of your fingertips. There's no delay as there is with painting or with sculpture. So I think I'm advancing faster as an artist, having returned to drawing just recently from 20-year absence.
His work for me is all about images and meaning, and when you look at his work, particularly the large steel structure that we had in the gallery, you see the most beautiful, delicate patterning on this huge sentinel that was watching over the gallery, and that very much is what Robert's work is all about. Never judge the work purely by the material and by the structure. The meaning and the historical readings of art very much relates to the core of Robert's practice. And I think for me, I think somehow relates a little bit to Robert as a person. When you meet Robert as an artist, he's a very tall, imposing figure. But when you come to know him personally, you feel he's a very gentle soul. So again, having grown up with it as this large, imposing figure, I think that translates beautifully into his artwork.
I have a love for ambiguity in art. I think it's its power that it can offer meaning to individuals, personal meaning, that's not necessarily present in the artist's mind. That's what keeps art interesting, because on repeat viewings you see something new, you bring an emotional state to your viewing, you bring an intelligence to it that's informed by more knowledge about the artist or more knowledge of the subject matter. So it's quite possible in a commission situation to produce a work that for me has a deep personal meaning, which the client is unaware of. So the idea really is to make good art. Make good art and then everything else follows.
I think one of the things I love about Robert's sculpture that is probably not so apparent is there's a sense of humour in the work. And for me, that humour comes out in what I sense to be a knowledge on his part of the history of sculptural form. And there's a lot of references in the work to different periods of sculpture. He'll mix things together. He'll do works that have a kind of reference to modernist, minimalist, abstract sculpture. Other parts may be figurative. Some may have, some reference to machine objects. Some, and he'll mix up surfaces. So, there'll be steel and marble or porcelain, say with the hammer works. But there's a playfulness about it. So it'll go from a very kind of serious, stern minimalism into a patterning. So there's a mixture of I guess, high art and colloquial forms through, arts and crafts, things like the patterning from plates put into the porcelain of the hammers. He'll put, kind of weird, almost like fleur-de-lis patterns in the metal. So that mixture to me is immediately very funny. It's quite amusing, but it also shows, as I say, a kind of sense of knowledge and understanding of the history of sculpture, which is quite rare. You don't tend to see that. Most I think a lot of contemporary sculpture is defined by an attempt to reach some sort of purity, where Robert seems to revel in mixing things together and seeing how those things can be in dialogue, how they can be in conversation with each other.
I take aspects of classical architecture, the language of monument, and mash it together in a way that I think produces the tone and the feeling, but not necessarily the underlying arguments that these monuments may have made in the past. And I like that because it leaves it open-ended.
I think it's quite fascinating to go back and think of the 1960s, because I think we must give credit to Anthony Caro and to some extent Philip King, because they liberated sculpture from the pedestal, or as we now say, the plinth. Instead of sculpture being an isolated object, you know, in its own little limited space, by abolishing the plinth and putting sculpture on the ground or on the floor, Anthony Caro sort of gave us a whole new way of viewing sculpture. And what I think is really fascinating is that Robert has taken the plinth and reinstalled it, but in a satirical, ironical fashion. The plinth might end up looking like a classical column. It might be decorated, heaven forbid. It might even levitate as though it has become weightless, or be shown on an exotic sort of carpet, not on the floor, not on the ground, but sitting on a decorative carpet. So all of those things is putting up your finger to your nose to Anthony Caro tradition, and I love it.
An artist's hand is still a really key part of art for me. While some ideas can be one-liners and they can be immediate and they'll never be any more than that, other ideas take painstaking effort and many, many hours of arduous labour to realise. And that shows in the work.